Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls.
We interrupt this program to give you a bulletin just received from one of our naval units at sea.
Hello, what have we here?
My God, it's full of stars.
Xenopod from the year 5000.
Welcome, everyone, to Xenopod from the year 5000. I am your host, Sean Drager, and with me today is Mark O'Connell. And Mark has a book out right now called Watching Skies, Star Wars, Spielberg and Us. And I figured, man, what a perfect guest to have on the show, because we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but we haven't jumped into full bore into kind of this era of films. And it's an era that's very near and dear to my heart. So, Mark, welcome to Xenopod from the year 5000.
Thank you. It's great to be here at last. I appreciate it.
So, you reached out to me, and I started, and then the book finally ended up on my doorstep, and I've been kind of thumbing through it and reading it, and it's such a mirror image in many ways of my childhood, because I was born in 1977. So I did not see the original Star Wars in theaters, but it was definitely, since I was born in that time, my parents were huge science fiction fans, and I was raised up in Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So I guess I wanted to start off with what is your story in relationship to those films? When did you kind of, because I'm assuming we're around the same age, or we've gone through the same era.
Yeah. I'm as young as you are. I'm even younger. I was born in 1975. So so I was born in 1975. I was born whilst Jaws was still riding the American box office charts. So I quite like the poetry of that, although it had disappeared from the British charts at that point. So I was born in 1975. So I wasn't one of those first wave New Hope kids or Star Wars kids. I wasn't in my t-shirt and flared denim queuing up, whether it was outside the Man Chinese Theatre or even the Odeon Leicester Square in London. I didn't actually see a Star Wars movie on the big screen till June 83, and Return of the Jedi. That's
probably about the same as me.
Yes, so in fact, the first Spielberg film I did see in a movie theatre, that was E.T., sort of 36 years ago, almost to the week now, because we got it in December. Everyone in the UK assumes E.T. was a summer release, and it was for you guys, but it wasn't at all. Likewise, Gremlins and Ghostbusters, they all came out at Christmas for us, which was always very strange. So my experience of Star Wars, in fact, the book goes into it in perhaps more poignant, better depth than I will here, but my first experience was I was visiting a family member who was in I'll cut to the chase. She's fine with me going there, but I was visiting my mother, who was in I suppose what you'd call a psychiatric unit these days. It was like a Victorian cathedral to mental health. It's no longer there. These days, my mother would never have even been in a context like that. But anyway, I was visiting, and Star Wars New Hope was on TV for the very first time on UK television. It was October 1982. And whilst I didn't really watch the film because of various distractions, I remember the whole sort of visitors room and the lounge pausing and watching it. And it was those days where everyone was smoking. So you were sort of trying to look through the sort of Marlborough mists to see. And I remember the Princess Leia confrontation with Vader. I can see that now. And then I left not that long into the movie, but I vividly remember the sort of pounding John Williams score as I was marching away down these corridors. Mm-hmm. And my mum was home in a few weeks anyway. It wasn't that traumatic, but that was my first experience. So I'm a VHS kid. I sort of came to these movies in the wrong order, at the wrong time. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have had it any other way.
Right. I mean, I it's kind of the same with me. I think the first big Star Wars memory I have is seeing Return of the Jedi in the theater. Yeah. And then I think I worked my way back. I must have, because I was very young, and I must have through the years worked my way back. But I have vivid memories myself of, we would always have like family movie night on Friday nights, and my brother, so we would kind of do like 2 to 3 movies. So my parents would pick a movie, and normally they would watch that themselves because we'd be tired and go to bed.
Yeah.
but my brother and I would get to pick a film, and we'd ride our bikes over to the local little VHS rental shop, and
Wow.
I would always grab either Return of the Jedi or Joe Dante's Explorers. Like those are the
Wow.
two that I
Yeah.
always, for some reason, would always rent. And I don't know how many times my parents must have watched those films with me, but those two films, the VHS the tapes were, always. I don't, and of course, I ended up buying like used copies eventually once those became available and everything. But those two films, especially for some reason, were huge influences on me, and then I kind of went from there. But yeah, at that time, we didn't have the blogs, or even I wasn't into magazines. I would just go into the rental store, the rental shop, or whatever they're called, and just browse the covers and go from there.
Yeah, it was a fascinating time. I mean, I've said it plenty of times, and we've all said it before. This pre-internet era of movie consumption and movie fandom it's sort of great that we have to explain it, because I think we are, we're in a sort of embarrassment of riches now with all these Star Wars movies and all of our franchises, or many of them, Rocky, Tron, Indiana Jones, Alien, they haven't really gone away. They've come back and filtered their way back into our movie theaters. But those days, yes, I remember the excitement of seeing like a Return of the Jedi logo in our local black and white newspapers, in a corner with like 3 or 4 clock times underneath the title. And I remember it was always like 15:05 or 11:02. It was always random numbers, but that's as close as we got to these movies. Plus, obviously, the figures, because the figures were in our lives. It was easier to find and own a Star Wars figure than it was to see a Star Wars movie at that time, which is sort of unfathomable if you think about it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. When I was kind of preparing for our conversation today, I was like, man, this is just going to be too. I mean, we're in our 40s now, so it's like these two old dudes talking about the heyday of these films.
How dare you say I'm in my 40s in a public forum like this? I'm 28 plus VAT.
Yes.
No, exactly. And I hate being that. I don't want to be that old guy sat on the rocking chair on the front porch, throwing rocks at automobiles going past, going, it'll never catch on. I don't want to be that guy, because I think, I always say this, whether it's Star Wars or Bond or Superman or Spielberg, it doesn't matter what your entry point was. The important thing is that you had one. So, so many kids love Superman and Superman movies because of Superman 3 and Supergirl. And I'm sort of slightly in that bracket myself, because that was the ones that were in my world and in my video store and in my sort of comic books and magazines.
Mine was Superman 4 of all films, and
Lord.
Supergirl. Like I loved those when I was younger.
Okay.
I haven't revisited Superman 4 in a long time, and I kind of just, that's one of those films I want to kind of just keep in my head on how I remembered it, because I loved the nuclear man and his nails and everything.
Yeah, you don't need to see it again. No, that it was a stolen kiss. That if you ever met that girl from prom night again and said, "Oh my gosh, that's not how I remembered it." Yeah, Quest for Peace is I went back to it recently for the book, and I was it's a curio. It's a curio. I've got a friend, Oliver Harper, who is he's a great knowledge of the film, but everyone acknowledges its faults. But it's still Christopher Reeve and Gene Hackman having their verbal joust, and it's still sort of a Salkind Superman movie, just about. It's not quite, because they lost the money and sold it off. But yeah, that's a brave admission. But then I'm the same with Bond. My Bond movies that I seriously hold close to my heart are all the ones that people sort of roll their eyes, older fans and younger fans, with this big why, and I can defend it to the hill. But as I say, it doesn't matter what your entry point was. That it's the important thing is that you had one.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this era of films, and especially like last night, for example, I watched the new Predator movie, The Predator.
Oh wow, yeah.
And I was kind of thinking like it was okay. I had some issues with it, but I don't know if that's me kind of looking at the older Predator films, 1 and 2 especially, through rose-colored glasses,
Yeah.
or if there is something tangible that I love about these films that the newer films can't recreate. And maybe it's just because I lived through this era of fully practical and optical kind of effects and animation rolled into these films, and then moving into this new generation of everything's digital. And that was my main issue with the new Predator film, was the main big bad Predator that's supposed to be this menacing thing was fully CGI creation. And for me, I was like, of course, there's no 10-foot guy to put a suit on or whatever. I mean, I get it. But for us, I was like, that was the missing mark for me. But I was wondering, like, how do you view that, the 80s era specifically? Because that, for me, and I don't know if it's just because I grew up in that time, but that for me, that's like the golden age of film. And I kind of will compare effects, or just how a certain film will make me feel. How do you kind of juggle the two? Because when it's all said and done, we're film buffs. Like, and we love. I love science fiction. I love fantasy. I'm going to give pretty much any film a fair shake. But do you feel there's a difference, or is it just our, kind of how we grew up in it? How do you juggle that?
Yeah, it's. I think it's definitely framed by some nostalgia. I often think pop culture itself, its sort of DNA or its lifeblood is nostalgia. Because it just has to be. But I also feel that the 80s, as an example, you say it was the golden age. I would say it was a golden age for me. And Watching Sky is my book. I sort of picked the 70s as that second golden era of Hollywood. But the 80s is a curious one because especially for people, that are framing it and discussing and writing about it nowadays, and it's everywhere. It's hashtag 80s, hashtag VHS. You can see it everywhere on all the movie chats and movie forums. But the 80s was, I think, actually for me, the glories, the movie glories of the 80s, and the ones I pick up on in the book, they actually were sort of they were the result of the tail end of the 70s. So if you look at E.T., it was shot in 81. It was probably written a year or two before that. So it's actually a late 70s movie. Likewise, certainly New Hope and Empire Strikes Back and Alien. So a lot of these 80s franchises, even Raiders, yes, it comes out in 81, but it was sort of formulated and conceived in that late 70s thinking and era. And I think that you can almost split the 80s into two halves when it comes to American cinema and those films we love. And you've got this sort of, I want to say hangover, there's better words than that, but this hangover of 70s-ness. And that's why I sort of ended the timeline on Watching Skies around 84, 85, although I do come back to future incarnations of Star Wars and Superman and Indiana Jones, because you just can't ignore that. But around 84, 85, American movies and 80s cinema, and it was probably the same in Britain as well, started to change. And we first of all lost Star Wars because Jedi was the last Star Wars film ever made. And then suddenly we got Caravan of Courage 84 just to keep some of our appetites going. But we didn't that sort of wonder of E.T. and Jaws and Close Encounters and Raiders slightly disappeared and got replaced by films like Daryl and Short Circuit and Space Camp and Flight of the Navigator, where those films were still playing to the kids and playing to their hunger for sci-fi and fantasy, but they would, and maybe it was just because they didn't have George Lucas style budgets, but these films became very earth-based. So Short Circuit's a great movie, but it's about NASA and it's about military, and there's a sort of cynicism to that as well, where these movies become very earth-based and there has to be a military angle, so the 80s is, and then onwards, then that whole yuppie, money grabbing property developer mindset that was sort of poison. Well, I'll say poisoning, but yeah, it was poisoning the world. You know, I think that obviously came into the late 80s with Fatal Attraction and Wall Street and even Platoon as well. So to give you a very long answer, I feel the 80s is sort of split into a couple of halves. But why? I mean, to then answer you a bit more, why are we in this era of nostalgia and homage and awareness of those films? And I think it comes down to a lot of things. Again, it's that pop culture sense of nostalgia and hindsight and those rose-colored glasses, as you say. But I also think we're in an era where all those 80s kids, you, me, the brothers, I can't remember their names, the Duffer Brothers, who did Stranger Things,
right.
that we're getting to a point where we're doing the writing, we're doing the producing or the commissioning, or and I think that what's happened is that the all of us 80s kids are finally, running the video store. The video store just happens to be called Netflix. That's, it's just got a different name, and we've got access to it in all our lounges.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, this kind of new wave of nostalgia, because it's good. It's spilling over into my kids, because my kids love Stranger Things. So when they got done watching that, they're like, "Dad, what's more movies like this?" And I'm like, "Well, you guys have seen Star Wars," and so we started finding all the things that were wrapped into Stranger Things, and starting to kind of go through a watch list of films. Of course, Gremlins and Predator and everything. Like we've gone through all these films with them, and they love it. But they kind of do giggle at some of the special effects, and they have an appreciation for the original Star Wars trilogy. But they're like, "Dad, some of the stuff looks kind of fake. We like the new ones better."
There are adoption services. You can use them. No, well, actually, I think there's another point about a lot of that 80s cinema, and I think Stranger Things is a good example. There was a quality and a purity to those movies and those titles. You look at Gremlins. Gremlins wasn't setting itself up to be a multi-film franchise. It wasn't trying to be Marvel, where every film is sort of signposting 5 films in the future, and often those films don't operate as films on their own in their own entirety. No one ever came out of Godfather 3 and said, "Do you know what? I thought it was a bit weak, but I can't wait for Godfather 7." That's sort of this multi-franchise extended universe world we live in. But there was a purity and an individualism to a lot of those movies, and I think kids are not stupid. They pick up on that, and I've got godkids, and they're also, I mean, they say it with pride that they've watched Jurassic Park, or they know the original Star Wars trilogy, and I think they're aware, they can sense that quality and that sense of storytelling. So we shouldn't always dismiss it. Not that you did, but I think that is an element as well. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think the thing with my kids with Star Wars, when they were young, I always had. They've kind of, it's just it's an extension of me in their eyes, and they're kind of on their little journey in pop culture. They're kind of gravitating for things that they can claim. So since I already have a stake in Star Wars, it's almost like they're like, "Yeah, we'll go over here," but they love Jurassic Park, and they have a respect for these things. And and as my daughter's getting older, she's 13 now. She's really starting to kind of go back and be like, "Hey, can we watch this?" And we just watched with my youngest, he's 6 years old. We just watched Neverending Story, and he just ate that film up. But it's just funny kind of seeing all these things kind of play throughout the decades and kind of come back around. I was just watching there's a band called Ghost, and they released a new video, I think it was today, called Dancing Macabre. And that video looks like it could be playing on MTV in 1986.
Right.
This is all kind of coming back around in a little bit of a fresh, rose-colored glasses way. I'm assuming the same thing happened, in the 80s. People looking back at the 50s and 60s, possibly. With
80s.
It's all cyclical.
Yeah, it's wheels within wheels. Pop culture is always wheels within wheels. And you're very right that you look at 80s, there was a massive interest in the early 60s and 50s. So we had films like Diner and Peggy Sue Got Married and Back to the Future. So yeah, maybe there's a cyclical thing. And also in the 70s there was an interest in like the 30s,
Right.
Bonnie and Clyde and the Sting. It's curious. I mean, it's sort of, I don't know, when are we going to have the noughties or the millennial sort of revisionist? But yeah, I just, as long as we've got good products that we'll look back on in 30 years time and go, no one's going to say The Predator or the new movie, but there is some little gems. I mean, some of the Marvel movies, and the new sequel trilogy for Star Wars, I think, is holding its own as pieces of cinema. So I think they'll, as long as it's not too diluted by too many series and spin-offs, I think we'll hopefully look back now and see those little gems. But there's still not those little individual movies. It's still, I don't know about you, but it's still a surprise sometimes when you see a trailer for a film you haven't heard of that looks like a quirky little standalone movie. I saw it. I can't even remember what the trailer was for. It was Danny Glover and Armie Hammer. I saw the trailer last night, and it starts at a call center and then just goes off on this crazy odyssey. And I thought, my God, it's so interesting just to see a film that's not a franchise, that's not going to be 5 sequels, a spin-off Netflix show. And I think that we've got to get that back a bit. That's something. You just have the standalone one-off great hits. It's not a crime to not do a sequel.
Sequels are where the money is. Speaking of where the money is, and this is something that, having kids and everything, I've kind of seen a difference with how my kids approach toys. When we were kids, it was all about the action figures. You talk quite a bit in your book about your action figures, and I wanted to because I always would always have some. My family was kind of like, I always wanted like the really big sets. Like I wanted the gigantic, AT-AT, and I wanted the Millennium Falcon, and I can never get those. And no matter how much I begged, it was never in the budget for my parents to get me one of those, and I wasn't disciplined enough to save up the money myself. But I loved my action figures. I had the G.I. Joes, I had Transformers, I had all the Star Wars characters. I would bridge universes in the backyard with my action figures. What was your experience with action figures, and what are your favorite memories about those? And
well, I think I was more aware of Star Wars, or initially aware of Star Wars, through the figures, definitely through the toys. I was spending a bit of the summer of '82. My parents were having quite a Kramer versus Kramer divorce. It was quite full on, and I went off and stayed with a friend of the family, and there was a kid called Gareth. I need to find him again because he was sort of apocryphal to my Star Wars timeline, but he had the Death Star, one of the Death Star play sets.
Oh man.
And the sort of the half sphere one, not the tall tower one, but the other one. And I remember just being fascinated by that. And he had these characters, Obi-Wan and Darth Vader, and that was just like mind blowing. It was, I don't know how you can have any equivalency now as a kid. But so that was, and then I slowly got some figures. My first figure was Forlom, which is the bug-eyed bounty hunter from Empire Strikes Back, it was probably because it was the only one available in the sort of discount box at the department store. So I had lots of Star Wars figures very quickly, and I took 12 of my founding fathers of Star Wars action figures. I took them to Crete, one of the Greek islands, on a family holiday, and I lost them all. And I was devastated. I lost them in a cab coming back from the airport. Our flight got diverted in the early hours to some random airport that we weren't meant to be at, and we got looking back, it was probably some illegal guy literally just driving his car around. So there was no way of tracking it down. And I still can't go through Gatwick, one of the London terminals, without just wondering, I might just check lost property. You never know. There could be like a glass case with my Snoopy bag and all my initial Star Wars figures in it. And it's like one of these, let's just see if someone claims it moments. But I was also, I mean, Star Wars was my thing. So I did have the X-Wings, and I was coming from a broken home. My parents were sort of quite heavily divorcing, as I say. Mm-hmm. But one of the upshots of that, and there weren't many at the time, but one of the upshots was, and one of the good things was that both sets of parents would be aware of what I was into. And I don't think they were playing each other off, but if my mum got me an X-Wing, my dad would get me an X-Wing. So suddenly I had two X-Wings. And like, I didn't have two AT-ATs, but I would have duplicates. And being little Star Wars 80s kids, we wouldn't own up, because actually having duplicates was not a bad thing, unless you really had your heart on sort of Bespin Luke or something. And I got the AT-AT, and Christmas 1984, not only did I finally see The Empire Strikes Back, I was finally able to rent it from the video store, and I cleverly booked it, because you had to book the films sometimes those days.
Yes.
I booked the one copy of Empire Strikes Back. We picked it up Christmas Eve, so I knew I had it for one night's fee, but the shop wasn't open for the next 4 days, so I had it over the whole Christmas period. And that was the same Christmas morning that I watched Empire Strikes Back and got my first and only Millennium Falcon from Kenner, and it was sensational. And looking at the money as well, you're right, my parents, we didn't have much money, but they would, I don't know, I was only child, but I was never spoiled, and perhaps they just put some money aside for Christmas. Right. And I was also I was into the trendy things as well, like He-Man. I had Skeletor and He-Man, and some of the more obvious ones. So yeah, I'm trying, what other 80s toys I had. I think it was more other things like Walkman as well. I remember getting a Walkman that same Christmas of '84, and I've still got it as well. And it's up in the attic. This sort of red thing. It's about the size of like a flight recorder. You sort of meant to strap it to your waist and listen to bad '80s hits. So yeah, I was there. But Star Wars was the main ones, definitely.
Yeah. I don't have very much left from my early days in toys that I've kept, and I've it's one of those things where I've kicked myself, for not being psychic and reading the future.
I know. I kept it. I don't know if it was because we had a big house and I was only child, but I kept things. I've got a lot of Celtic genes in me, and apparently Celts are very romantic and nostalgic, which explains most of my writing from the last 10 years. And I think that's why I just kept them all. Although my mum, she was moving house, and I came home one day and there was an AT-AT on the front doorstep. It was like an abandoned puppy. And she sent me a text going, you throw it away if you want to, but I don't know if you wanted it. And I was like, oh, thank you for at least giving me the choice. And there was like a sort of refuse sack of Star Wars figures. Like, it was like some sort of, I don't know, refugee exodus from one house to another. And so I've still got them. I was lucky. I don't know why, the hindsight of keeping them all. But yeah, that was sort of my, being an only child helps.
Yeah. Yeah. The only thing I have remaining is I had a stuffed Wicket Ewok that I lost his little whatever you call it, his little headgear.
Yeah,
but he's still he's right here on my desk. Actually, I have him and another childhood stuffed animal. The only
I so wanted that Wicket, and my mum said, "I've got you the Wicket for your birthday." I think it was like 10 or something, and it wasn't Wicket. It was one of the little baby Ewoks. And I remember like, that's not Wicket, but I was like, okay, and he wasn't grey, but okay. Yeah, no, I was quite obsessed by Wicket at the time. I remember that one. I remember that toy as well. So yeah, hold on to it.
Yeah.
And, maybe he'll get his headdress back one day.
Someday. I was scouring eBay, every now and then.
Yeah.
So you and I both, we kind of gravitate back towards these, mainly, Star Wars, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg films. And especially Star Wars. And for me, I mean, you come into my office here in the studio, I have a Star Wars blanket, Star Wars pillows, I have Star Wars things on the wall. It's for some reason this one franchise has stuck with me for so long, and part of it is nostalgia, but I mean, there's plenty of movies that formed my childhood and kind of formed me into the movie geek that I am. But I want to talk a little bit about Star Wars here, and in your book, you were very kind to the prequels, and I remember I haven't revisited those in so long because I remember initially when they came out, that was so soured on the prequels. But yourself and your writing. I listened to a few other Star Wars podcasts. They've revisited them and kind of just like accepted them, but kind of accepted and I guess discovered how the story weaves into the original trilogy, and then now they're being weaved into things like Rogue One and even into the new trilogy that's coming out, and in all the supplemental, all the cartoons and everything. What was your initial kind of I guess, how did you view the original prequel when it came out, and then how have you come to your, I guess, I wouldn't say acceptance is like you just admit defeat and accept it, but you did you did have some good things to say about the storytelling aspect of it.
Don't get me wrong, the prequels are still a mixed bag for me, and I wouldn't. My childhood wasn't ruined by George Lucas making the prequels, as some like to claim.
Right, and I would never say that either.
Because I was actually an adult when they came out, and my childhood was based on New Hope, Return of the Jedi, Empire Strikes Back, Raiders. George Lucas and Spielberg enhanced and utterly supported and bolstered my childhood. They, whatever they did when all of us were older adults, it's ridiculous to say they ruined my childhood, or even people use even worse words for what they did to the childhood. Anyway, I mean, like, I don't know about your kids, I'm not, but I've met so many adults in their 20s or early 20s who fell in love with Star Wars because of the pod race and Anakin and Phantom Menace. And that was hard to sort of to listen to and accept, because you go, but just watch Empire Strikes Back, and they're aware of it. But that was their point, because it was Phantom Menace was a lot of kids' cultural currency.
Yeah, well, a lot of parents were taking their kids to the new, it's a new Star Wars film, let's all go as a family. It was a huge event. I mean, a huge touchstone.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think, oddly, the Phantom Menace, which was the one that got most derided so fiercely and so quickly, is the one that's holding up the best, because it's not trying to do too much, and it keeps that sense of trio. A few people have pinned that to Lucas and Star Wars. 3 characters, 3 worlds, 3 acts, often a palette of 3 colors. It tries to sort of stick with that a little bit, and then I just think Lucas, the storytelling just went too wide and was bringing in too much, politics. I don't think any kid or adult cares that much about trade federation routes and all of that, and unions, and it just felt a bit clunky and a bit heavy. And one of the strange things of Phantom Menace is you got Jake Lloyd playing Anakin, and he looks, sounds, and is the kids that we all were when we fell in love with Star Wars. But now that Star Wars kid is in a Star Wars movie, and regardless of his acting skills, or whether he's a bit grating or irritating, I don't mind him in it. We just find it hard to look at that film for that one of those reasons. I feel that perhaps we could have started later. I felt there was parts of Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith that really worked. I just felt we could have just taken more time, just stand back and get the focus right. There was a forever changing roster of villainy and sub-generals, and it was I was trying. Sometimes those prequels struggle to know where their point is and where their story is amongst all the, because it's like making a prequel to Titanic. No matter what happens, we know that Anakin Skywalker is going to hit the iceberg,
Uh-huh.
and his morals and life is going to sink beneath very cold waters, and that we know that. So, however you do it, you, as I say in the book, the prequels and the whole thing of the whole genre of prequels, or the whole world of prequels, is they're damned from the start. Because they're adding punctuation to sentences that are already written, and that will always be the flaw of the prequel. Although saying that, look at Rogue One. That's
Right, I was just about to mention. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a prequel, and that works really well. It's a really competent piece of cinema and a really competent piece of Star Wars storytelling. And in fact, I think Rogue One is got some of the best directional choices of any Star Wars film. You know, Rogue One is a better directed film than Return of the Jedi, no matter however you argue it. I don't know how to take
that. I don't know.
Yeah, it's
my childhood self is wrestling with my adult self right now.
Well, welcome to Jake Lloyd's world. No,
oh man,
no. So I don't hate the prequels. I like the world. I like being immersed back in that world, and I think actually the story decisions Lucas took, whilst you can't defend them by saying one film in 20 years' time is going to join those dots a bit better, you know, Rogue One, or maybe we'll get an Obi-Wan spin-off movie, and the Mandalorian TV series. You can't say that. You can't defend one film by saying, just wait, it's going to all make sense in 20 years. But those films, they've sort of bedded in. It's almost like the seedlings have grown up and they're no longer sort of remote, separate saplings. They're growing into each other, and, you know, the stories are threading and they're starting to make a sense. And whilst I didn't personally think the Darth Maul presence and then inclusion in Solo was justified or earned, I don't think it was justified. And the movie fans, the last time they saw him, he was cut in half. I know that there was a story world, a story world that explained that, but I'm a movie Star Wars fan, and if that needs to be explained. But saying that, when Darth Maul appears in towards the end of Solo, I was thinking, okay, that sort of justifies what Lucas did. Not that he had that planned. So I think there are faults in the prequels. But then do you? I'm sure you do. But do you remember that anticipation, that first trailer?
Oh man,
yeah. And just as perhaps Star Wars changed, or New Hope and Empire changed movie queuing for the movies and buying toys for the movies and bedspreads and top sticker albums and all of that, just as that became such a thing, when the prequels came along, I remember it was the very first time I'd watched a trailer outside of a movie theater. We watched it on my friend's computer, and I think it was dial-up, and it was New Year's Eve, I remember, and it took 2 hours to download it. And we watched this trailer, and it was about the size of like a cigarette box on this big screen, and the sound didn't quite sync. But when those creatures and we all thought it was Dagobah, when those sort of creatures canter across sort of misty swamp lands, we were gobsmacked by that, and I felt nothing but what I originally felt about those films. And then that poster of young Anakin and his shadows, obviously Vader, that was I don't think those prequels got as good as that poster and that trailer. And that's perhaps that's the missed beat.
Yeah,
but it still had some glories.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things where you kind of start looking back at all this and seeing how, you know, everything's kind of, like you've said, been threaded together. And you said something you in your book. I remember you wrote about kind of George Lucas, kind of being taken by the technology and maybe going too fast, too hard, leaning into the new technology.
Yes.
Because Jurassic Park had hit. People were like, "Oh wow, these digital effects, you know, combined with the practical look pretty amazing." So he just decides, "I'm going to do new technology. We're going to shoot these completely digital." Can you explain a little bit about what you're saying about that? Because I think that actually is a very interesting thing, because George Lucas and even James Cameron, to their faults, have leaned into new technology just a little too much, where it overtakes things.
Well, it underlines
Uh-huh.
George Lucas's fascination in technology and fascination in what technology can do in the entertainment industries, particularly in the computer industry. And people say, oh, he was tampering and changing stuff, and there's 97 re-releases and all the subsequent little bits he's put in and chopped and changed. I mean, I think there's something wrong when a CGI Jawa falling off, a creature at Mos Eisley looks dated quicker than perhaps a puppet or a little guy in an outfit in Tunisia. There's something wrong in that. But people forget, or sometimes, that George Lucas was like a piece of ice or a piece of wood that he was forever sculpting and chipping away at. So he was changing and augmenting the first Star Wars movie. 2 or 3 weeks later, he was putting an extra sound effect in. And the best example of that is adding the crawl adding the episode 4 to the crawl and giving it that context, which wasn't there initially. And I think, oddly, one of the things that Lucas gets criticized on, tampering and constantly renovating those films, I think it's actually what it's why we've got Star Wars movies now, because they proved a revenue, they proved money. I mean, this is the movie industry, this is Hollywood, it's show business. Things have got to make a profit and be invested into further projects. But he was keeping them relevant. So, yes, we were all falling for it, and we were buying our super deluxe widescreen CBS Fox VHS tapes that we thought were the ultimate, and there'll always be another ultimate. We thought DVD was it, and then no, it's not. Blu-ray, no, it's 4K, and 4K will soon be the beta, I'm sure, on that sort of Darwinian timeline of movie exhibition and movie consumption. But yes, I do think it came perhaps to the surface more with the prequels. He was you can see the technologies taking over. According to sort of folklore about these movies, Lucas was always less interested in acting and writing. When Carrie Fisher wanted some motivation for a scene, he'd say, well, just do it like they do in the movies. And, that doesn't help an actor. And perhaps that was fine because Lucas was there at the beginning of that real revolution of special effects.
Yeah. Now,
there was another revolution of special effects, but I think in terms of the timeline of visual effects, Jurassic Park has got a bigger, flag in the sand than any of the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah.
And I think maybe he was sort of caught in a different era where he perhaps, I don't know, I'm just suggesting this off the top of my head, that he didn't quite have the grasp and the hold on it. It perhaps got out of his reach, and I don't know.
Yeah, I think he saw the potential. I think he was trying to. There was a lot of figuring it out as he went. And in his mind, in a perfect technological world with perfect CGI effects, you wouldn't really need a set, but we still haven't been able to marry digital with real looking, with reality. It just has not even happened yet in 2018. We're getting better, but there's still that like film. There's still like a little. You can always tell the digital, the CGI.
Absolutely, and I think it's like. And without sounding like those old men in the rocking chairs throwing rocks at the Ford cars going past. There's Lucas. We criticize Lucas, or some people do, about his technology, but first of all, he put so much of his own money and life and relationships and resources and time into these movies, and he was supporting filmmakers like John Lasseter and Pixar and some of the Japanese director. He was actually doing a lot for cinema on the sides, and I think he still does as well. So, as I say, it's a curious one, but I still think there's more merit. There's more storytelling merit, and Force Awakens understood this as well. Yeah. I think I'd rather see a rubber puppet, like a vulture alien, chipping away at some roadkill that's blatantly a puppet, or or if it's CGI, it's been CGI to look like a puppet. I think there's more merit to that than Jawas falling off, dewbacks at Mos Eisley, CGI, and it has that artifice. Yes, we don't want to see the strings holding an X-wing up in the air, but the strings say that that's how it was made.
Yeah.
That was how it was done. And the artifice, I think often, not that Lucas did this, but the artifice of cinema is a valid point of it, is a valid part of it. And we shouldn't just try and, because the whole idea of putting a camera in front of a scene or a building or an actor, that's fake. You've made a decision. And the artifice is part of cinema, so just embrace it rather than try and hide it with CGI and all of that. I think CGI is better used when it creates landscapes and perhaps changes the front of a house and you don't notice it. And I think that's where it's evolving in a more invisible way at the moment. Look at The Crown. The Crown is sort of 90% CGI, but you wouldn't know it because it's just delicate and subtle.
Yeah. That's pretty incredible. I mean, see, all of that. Spielberg and Lucas did help pave the way. I mean, I think George Lucas helped pave a way towards digital photography, digital film. Because he wanted to shoot, I think Phantom Menace for sure. It was shot in 1080, I believe, because he wanted and I think that was the red camera. If I'm remembering this correctly, was developed for the prequel trilogy, and then they build on from that. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are quick to, kind of trash talk George Lucas and through all this, but it's funny. I met him a few years back. I don't know if I've told the story on the podcast or anything. I don't think I've told it before, but I was in Vegas with my in-laws and my wife, and we were just walking through one of the hotel shopping centers, and my wife goes, "Hey, Sean, that guy over there looks familiar." And I look over, and there's George Lucas in like a wallet shop, And it's like the blood.
Well, he's got a lot of money. He has to buy a lot of wallets.
The blood like drained from my face. I got my hands got clammy. I got super nervous, and I was like, "That's George Lucas." And it was like, no matter how I felt about the prequels, it was like this guy is like responsible for like the foundation of like my childhood and geekdom altogether. So, my wife was like, "Well, are you gonna say hi to him?" And I was like, well, he's out shopping. I really don't want to bother him. Yes, I'll go bother him.
Yeah. Because I had a similar experience with Spielberg this year, and he was like literally shoulder to shoulder with me, and I did that. I mustn't. This is his time, his space, his world, his colleagues. Meryl Streep was next to him. They were talking about certain people in Hollywood who, names won't be mentioned because court cases are pending, and I was like, this is so surreal. And I didn't nudge him. I wanted to, and I wanted to be. But so you did? Did you talk to Lucas?
So I kind of hung out, and they went out of that shop, and they walked into like a clothing store, and I was like, well, I'm just gonna go look at some suits I can't afford. So I kind of ended up in the same store as him, and I'm looking at suits, and I kind of wander over to him. He's looking at suits. I think they were. I don't know. They weren't shopping from him because he was wearing the plaid shirt and the jeans, like the classic George Lucas
Thank
uniform.
God. I would hate that he was wearing like a Netflix t-shirt or something. Yeah.
So I kind of saunter over and I'm browsing, and I look at him and I go, "Oh," I go, "Hi." I go, "You're George Lucas." And he looks at me and he goes, "No, I'm not."
Oh. Okay.
And I could tell, I was like, "Oh man." And I go, and I just went, I go, "You are." And I said, "Look," I go, "I really don't want to bother you. I know this is your time." And I said, "But I just wanted to let you know that I wanted to thank you for your films." I go, "My kids are becoming Star Wars fans, and they love it as well." And as soon as I mentioned my kids, his eyes brightened up, and he went, "Oh," and he said, "Well, thank you." And then my wife came in. She's Miss Personality, and she's like, "Hi, my husband's a huge fan." And she's like, "Can we get a picture?" And he was very generous.
Yeah. The other half, the wives, and my husband's always the same. They just forget we've worried about that etiquette. We've imagined that moment for 30 years, but they're like, Let's just yeah. And did you get a photo?
We got a photo, and
excellent.
and it's hilarious because I looked at the picture and I was like, he's not smiling. But then I looked at every single picture of George Lucas ever, and he's never smiling.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, all right, so I'm good. But I was just, he was very, very nice, and it's just so funny that he tried to deny that he's George Lucas, and it was just like, I'm like, man, you've been in my brain since like I was born. So it's like it's you. So
Well, when I was alongside Spielberg, I just so wanted to get his hand. First of all, say thank you, and I would have left it at that.
Mhm.
But I also wanted to say, I wanted sort of the British comic in me. I was so tempted to say, I'm so glad your films are finally getting an audience. But I just thought that might not translate. And the same with Meryl Streep. I just wanted to say, I'm so glad you're finally getting the parts, Meryl. You've been slogging away for 40 years. But I thought, no. And I just didn't. And I'm just hoping the karma gods look down on me and remember that I gave Mr. Spielberg his space that day.
did.
And actually, 2 months later, I was in the same room as him again. And I had less chance to get near, actually. But I'm just thinking that I'm just going to keep ignoring him. That's what I'll do. I'll keep ignoring him in person until he comes knocking on my door.
Right.
And then I'll believe the karma gods. But that's a good one, meeting George Lucas and getting a photo. That is a good moment.
Ridiculous. That was probably the most starstruck I've been my entire life. And I've worked with bands. I've traveled with bands. I've met like some of my heroes in music, and this was like, this took the cake. This was ridiculous. Before we do wrap up, I do want to give you a chance to talk about Watching Skies, Star Wars, Spielberg and Us. It's out right now, both in the UK and in the US.
That's right.
Is there anything that we haven't covered? Is there anything else you'd like to say about the book before we wrap up?
No, it's just I intended it to be. It's a memoir through cinema, but it's universal. I wanted this book more than I did a book before about being a Bond fan that was very specific to me and my Bond story, because I had links. And that's a different chat another time. But I wanted this one to be universal, and the response and the readers that have come to me going, I remember that, I saw that screening, or I got that toy in that way, and also the more poignant side of it as well. As I said, I came from a broken home. Well, it wasn't broken. We just changed home. That's all it was. and so many 80s movie fans who are movie kids have come to me and said, I was that child with a single parent and we didn't have enough money, but we would go and would get a Star Wars figure every month. And everyone's come out of the woodwork, and it's been so great. So I've been really pleased by the response, the sort of universal response. And it's a book, as I say, it's a memoir through cinema. It's looking at Star Wars, Spielberg, Superman, Gremlins, Poltergeist, Indiana Jones, but looking at why those films are so brilliant, not just they're brilliant because we loved them, but what happened in that very small, I say it's a very small window of time, but it's a time that let in a hell of a lot of brilliant cinematic light. I mean, you look at, even just that 6, 7, 8 year period of movies, Raiders, Star Wars, E.T., Close Encounters, Jaws, they weren't just popular in the 70s and 80s. They're like key grammar of this of the language of 20th century cinema. So that's what I tried to look at. So what did Close Encounters do? Apart from being an amazing UFO movie, it changed how our expectations of sound and sound exhibition. When E.T. was the most pirated movie of all time, that meant it was the most watched at home movie of all time. So that had some relevance, I think. So each film I try and look at the different things. I think one of the visual templates of Indiana Jones and Raiders was done by the poster artist Richard Amsel, who died of AIDS in the mid-80s, and we lost him way too young. But he was this gay designer that created this action template with Indiana Jones and Harrison Ford, and we see it as such a straight matinee adventure idol. But so it's just slightly refocusing, new focus, I suppose that's the phrase, new focus, but still immersing ourselves in the nostalgia of it all. That's what Watching Skies does.
No, it excuse me. No, it is great. And what I did love was the memoir approach to this, the personal the personal story you inject into these films, because anybody can write about that era of film and get all the facts right and everything, but the personal aspect to it, the personality that you bring to each of these movies and your lens that you've viewed these movies through is great. So I want to make sure anyone can go check it out. Go to, let's see, well, you can go to markoconnell.co.uk. It's also available. It's on Amazon. Is there any other places online that people can find you and find the book?
Well, put in #watching skies and you'll find me and my photos and my thoughts of all of that era of cinema. We've got a great page on Facebook now that's generating lots of imagery and chats. So please, by all means, guys, find me and say hi. I want to be surrounded by fellow VHS kids.
Awesome. All right, Mark O'Connell, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today, and I look forward to having more conversations. There's so much more we can even dive into even further in the future. So I definitely would welcome you back.
And Explorers is coming back. I don't know if you know this, but Explorers is coming back. So, so good news there. But anyway, I appreciate it, Sean. Thank you for inviting me along.
You're welcome.